Boris Johnson has handed over his messages, all his WhatsApp messages, all his private notebooks. But the Cabinet Office, interestingly, which is representing the government, has so far, at the time of recording, it might change by the time you see it, but so far, they've refused to hand over his private information. I mean, Tom, that aside, there is a deeper political significance to this inquiry.
Oh, of course. I mean, and you almost forget that it's supposed to be about the pandemic and the lockdown and everything, because it has very quickly descended into a kind of political jousting match between Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak. I think Boris handing these messages in seems if more aimed at just trying to embarrass Sunak, force him to look cagey or whatever it might be, rather than anything else. But I think in a way there's a bit of a salutary lesson about the fact that whilst it might have happened quite quickly, inquiries such as this often become farcical in the end anyway.
Yeah.
They're often presented as exercises in transparency, accountability, but often this is part of the reason they go on for so long, and as happens in this case, we've given such broad terms of reference, is that it allows a government to say, we're doing something, we're reflecting, we've got this judge-led inquiry, it will report about 3 governments after we're out of power. So this is, even that kind of takes a lot of the heat out of the particular issue. And then even the kind of the amount of documents that we're talking about is a bit of a reminder of how broad this inquiry has been set out to be. So there's the usual things you would guess around what was the pandemic planning, how did they respond in the moment, what was the strength of the evidence, and so on and so forth. But then you also see things around institutional racism.
Yeah.
There's a lot of therapeutic stuff in there about how there's going to be a kind of national listening exercise that everyone can have their own grievances aired and their own kind of stories spoken to. And then also, without wanting to sound too cynical, and they haven't held even a single hearing yet, you can't help but feel that the narrative, even kind of the conclusions, has kind of been pre-drafted, because the entire discussion around the pandemic, around lockdown, is why didn't they go in earlier? Why didn't they lock us down for longer, harder, etc.? And any kind of questions that I think really need to be asked around civil liberties. You know, we've had pandemics before, we haven't had lockdowns before. Surely that should be investigated. You know, are not going to be there. So I think if anything, I think it descending into farce so quickly has been a useful reminder of how these inquiries are often farcical in the end anyway. They're not about accountability, they're about buck passing, and they often very rarely get to the heart of the issue as it's supposed to be.
Yeah, I mean, and Simon, don't we already know our view of the inquiry? I mean, for me and for Spikes, the biggest scandal is lockdown. For other people, the scandal will be the alleged lack of lockdown. I've never quite understood that argument, but you know, why do we need this exercise to tell us what?
Well, I agree with everything Tom said, and I'm a little bit older than both of you, and I remember probably even further back into inquiries that went back. I mean, obviously, Leveson was the phone hacking one, wasn't it? Before that, I can remember the name of the inquiry for the 2003, the Chilcot, right? And then even before that, I remember when I was at university studying law, the one came out. I think it was the Scarman report, which about policing in Brixton, which had led to the riots.
Brixton riots, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, none of these things have any impact. The Stephen Lawrence one probably had some impact on the culture in the Met, but even now we're finding out that the Met is still riddled with the stuff. It feeds into a sort of political biography culture, I suppose. At some point, somebody will want to read it and kind of go, "Oh, that was interesting." I mean, a lot of us, if we're honest, do treat the whole thing like a soap opera. My wife actually worked for a communications PR department for the vaccine task force during the pandemic, which was a handy revenue stream when I was out of work. And I was sort of bringing her up cups of coffee and trying not to look at the screen where she had Dominic Cummings in the top right-hand corner or whatever. But she would tell me stories that would turn your hair white about the internecine kind of squabbling. Essentially, you know, people trying to take ownership of good things and disavow bad things and anything that went wrong. Nobody's signature could attach to it. And it was a very human story. I mean, as it's been said so often as to become banal, but Westminster really was absolutely nailed by Iannucci's satire on it, and never more so than during that pandemic, I think. You're not going to find anything very useful because nobody like stuck their head over the parapet, you know. My sympathy really went to Boris Johnson a great deal. Everything that's been leaked about his response to it, which did seem to be inclined towards us, you know, as we share that libertarian view that not exactly let her rip, but more on that side towards, rather than like what I think we just kind of bought the Chinese approach wholesale. It seems extraordinary to me. But as you say, before you start with these inquiries, there's always an anchoring moment where somebody gets the upper hand and the question becomes, why didn't we X? Never why did we, what did we do and why did we do it? But why didn't we err further on the side of X or Y? That's happened. And that's that. We're not going to change that now. And there'll be chat groups, and I've got mates on WhatsApp messaging, who are still absolutely persuaded that the clot shot is going to take action any moment now, and we're all going to keel over dead. There are plenty of people whose minds have been, probably permanently. And actually, I laugh about it, but I think some people have been really destabilized by it because
that's very true,
it was an extraordinarily vicious, unprecedented, and frankly unwarranted expression of state power, which is just not a very British thing. And I was appalled at how easily the British were led into it. I mean, I was really disappointed, in us as a nation.
And what a fruitful inquiry, conversation, maybe not an inquiry for the reasons we've talked about, but you just feel like there's so much unfinished business from the pandemic and from lockdown in particular. The psychology of locking people up, as you say, the number of people of seemingly sound mind or relatively sound mind previously, you got dragged down one rabbit hole of another. The willingness of us all to go into that, the kind of atmosphere of fear that was created and how that was weaponized. And also the dreadfulness of the response. I mean, one thing that was really fascinating from the lockdown files, which I think in the space of a week was a lot more useful than this inquiry will be in the space of however many years it's going to run on, was just how unserious these politicians were, even in such a serious time. I mean, I heard Fraser Nelson talking about this recently on Spectator podcast. He was involved in the lockdown files. He's read every word of the Matt Hancock WhatsApp messages. And he was saying they weren't sharing massive papers. They were sending around to each other screenshots of graphs from Twitter. This is what decision-making was based on. We all remember that big shift from Whitty and Vallance being, again, kind of erring on the side of caution, erring on the side of we can't shut things down too much because how when are we going to open up and so on.
Here's some advice. All
of that just turning on a dime essentially under a moment of panic. And I think that's something that we've already got to see, but at the same time I wish just generally in journalism and media and public discussion we focused a bit more on what the hell was lockdown about rather than who's to blame for this terrible crisis, which is all Boris Johnson's fault.
You remember the moment, I mean, if I had a single moment that disgusted me really in terms of the media and their abdicating their responsibility to explain and clarify difficult decisions, it was the excitement they felt when they nailed Cummings and his trip to Durham. I mean, that became the whole story. I mean, you talk about Schofield. He was like that. He was the Schofield of that moment.
Well, one-man pandemic spreader.
And I genuinely believe that was a kind of mass psychosis. Well, a mass psychosis, but it was a widespread hallucination where what they thought they were seeing was Cummings escaping the consequences of Brexit. They thought Cummings had created Brexit and then would abscond and go and live in a house in France and somehow be able to get away with it. And that didn't happen. And then they think he kind of was caused, like he was responsible for the pandemic lockdown and everything, and then he got away with that. And so that it was a transfer of guilt or evaded guilt
kind
for that.
Scapegoating.
Yeah, but like a Munchausen's by proxy, like a second cousin of scapegoat. So he was not being scapegoated for the pandemic. He was already to blame for Brexit. There was a massive hole there waiting to. Anyway, that was my view. But it's the human interest thing. This is all the newspapers can do now. They have given up on trying to educate us or inform us on anything that is remotely abstract, that requires thinking, that requires subjunctive clauses. They have given up on that. And all they can do is erect dummies, guys, effigies, and then encourage us to throw things at them. That's it.
Let's hope we get those horrible guys at the inquiry. See them in jail.